Be advised, ye who enter here. The crowd had been buzzing like a swarm of anxious insects, but as the deep, resonant voice spilled over them, they quieted. This is a horror fiction live show. The crowd was a-twitter with restless legs and barely contained whispers. The venue, an old playhouse that stood for another few days, was the perfect locale for this year's Halloween show. The building had a rich history of hauntings, strange activity, and a dark past that would make the ambience all the spookier. Shelley was happy that they had secured the place. The owner had seemed surprised that she wanted to use it, and they had taken relatively little to rent it. As Tobias sat on stage, Cindy on his left and Lucius on his right, the crowd sat anxiously before them. Shelley knew this was going to be a show to remember. Those with weak constitutions or questionable mental states should be advised to proceed at their own risk. The crowd began to cheer, and Shelley saw a runner of dust shifting from the rafters. Hopefully this old place wouldn't collapse in on them. You have been warned. To those who remain, brace yourself for the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. The applause were deafening, and Shelley knew there would be some serious editing in post to make sure that it was usable. She saw some trails of dust wafting from the ceiling as the cheers escalated, and thought about how the structural integrity of this place was likely to be poor. They had placed 500 of the show's closest fans in the rickety seats in the main showroom, and the gas lamps lit the scene in a ghostly way that couldn't be fabricated. The chandelier overhead was lit by 1,000 real candles, the effort of an hour or more, but it cast the second glow over the room that would only add to the ambience. "Make sure you keep a steady shot over the crowd," she told the cameraman quietly, and he gave her a thumbs up as he swept the crowd. When the network saw this, it would be impossible for them to refuse their proposal. The Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast was the third most popular horror podcast on Stitcher, the fifth most listened to on Spotify, and had over 1 million fans worldwide. The show had been steadily rising in the ranks, but its numbers had stagnated a few months ago. People were only so interested in scary story podcasts, and the production team had been looking for ways to boost the listeners. They had tried the usual hooks, giveaways, collaborations, longer episodes, but nothing seemed to be working. That was when Creepshow had approached them. Creepshow was an online network that streamed horror content and provided a platform for horror creators. They had been turned down by other narrators and had finally come to see if they could secure the voice and story talent of the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. They had wanted a test tape, something they could send to their backers to prove the show belonged on the network. Thus, here they were, shooting a Halloween episode in this abandoned theater. The showing had been good, 500 screaming fans, and Tobias's sultry voice moving among them like a cloud of death, infecting them all with excitement. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm your host, Tobias Mons, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. If you're listening from home, then let me just say you're missing a truly creepy experience. We're coming to you live from the Sheridan Theater. This theater has played host to not only many of the greatest musical talents of the last 30 years, but also a host of grisly murders and suicide. The blood has run thick between the boards of this old building, and where better to tell our spooky tales tonight than right here? The audience quieted, settling in for the start of the show. The cameras panned over the crowd of expectant 20-somethings as they spoke in a hush. Shelley glanced over the crowd and had to do a double take when she saw someone standing in the center aisle. She was a lithe little thing, wearing something like a zombie costume, walking up the center stage. Her long dark hair swayed as she came, and Shelby couldn't help but sigh as she thought, "Crazed fan." Shelby got on the radio to call security to intercept her, but when she glanced back, the girl was gone. Shelley scanned the crowd and found that no one even looked close to the way the girl had. She put it out of her mind as Tobias started his first story. Our first tale is about a man with a dream. He wants to be a ventriloquist, but the dummy he finds is anything but helpful. Submitted for your approval, I give you Wooden Nickel. As he began the story about a possessed puppet, Shelby looked down at the camera display sitting before her. The booth was set up in one of the balconies that overlooked the stage and seats. Each of the other balconies held cameras that caught the scene below from a different angle, and by the end, they would have 3 or 4 different views of the stage. They would edit everything together later, and the results would give them something cool to send to Creepshow. As she watched the camera feeds, one of the upper balcony lights began to wink, casting a flickering eyesore over the stage. Shelley glanced at the upper balcony and saw the can flickering as it hung from the railing. She had the walkie to her lips, trying to route someone up there, when she saw a murky shadow skulking up on the landing in the inky blackness. What the hell was going on up there? Those landings were supposed to be closed off. Some rogue fan would ruin this taping for them, and she took off for the stairs to see who was mucking around. When she found the padlock still on the door, however, Shelley wrinkled her brow and hesitated as she took it off. When she found the balcony empty, Shelley left in a hurry, locking the door behind her. She came back down to a shouting match in the hallway. Derek was the senior camera tech for the troupe. He was a big guy with a bushy beard and a cap snugged down over his graying hair, and he had been with the show for a while. He was yelling at Cecily, the stage manager, and she came back in time to hear him saying that he was going to leave, and she couldn't stop him. Cecily was in tears. Tears were usually not far from her, and she begged him not to go. Who would run the board? Who would maintain the feeds? I don't care. I told you yesterday this job wasn't worth my life. Ah, yes. Yesterday. They had been setting up all day yesterday, trying to get the wiring in the old theater to cooperate. The old theater had never been intended to run the equipment they were bringing in, and they had run the cables from the van and started setting up nonetheless. Everyone knew the place had a reputation for spooks. It was supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the city. By the end of the day, everyone in the troupe found out it was well earned, too. It started as things seen out of the corner of the eye. They were things easily ignored, until later, when you had time to think about it. Derek had seen something, too, and he told Paul and Mark to help him search the building earlier that day. It could be a homeless guy, he said, and we don't want to be jumped on by some meth head while our backs are turned. They spent the first hour searching the building, from attic to basement, but found nothing but an angry cat and some wasps in the rafters. When they gave the crew the all clear, those who hadn't searched milling about the alley next to the theater, everyone got back to work. Shelley would still catch things out of the corner of her eye, though. Shadows, slight movements, but she brushed it all off as nerves. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, and it was only natural that she would be a little nervous here. When they broke for lunch, Paul had already been talking about seeing someone on the theater floor. Everyone told him he was nuts, but he was adamant that he had seen someone down there. I was hanging lights in one of the balconies, and when I looked down, I saw this woman walking towards the stage. She was holding her stomach, staggering like a drunk, but before I could call out to her, she just disappeared. They brushed it off, saying the dust or the lights were playing tricks on him, but after what Shelley had seen earlier, she couldn't help but wonder. Derek's accident had happened near dark. Shelley had been setting up the stage when she heard a loud crash and Derek's bear-like yell. He had fallen into the railing on one of the boxes, the rail cracking and threatening to spill him. He was breathing heavily and looking around frantically as Shelley stood looking at him. He seemed unable to push off the rail, unwilling, and wouldn't move until Shelley and Mark came up there to get him. He was sitting then, shuddering and looking furtively around. He looked terrified. "What happened?" Shelley asked, and when she tried to touch him, he shuddered away from her. "Someone tried to attack me," he stammered, pointing to the shadow area behind the door of the box. "I turned to leave after setting up the cameras, and it was just standing there on the balcony. I thought it was one of you at first, but it weren't right. It was like a person made out of shadows. It was wearing a suit and a hat, smiling this huge, horrible grin. And then it laughed. It burst out of it, and it came towards me. Its laughter sounded like the roar of a wildcat, and when it opened that smiling mouth to try to eat me, I almost fell through the railing as I backed away. When I looked back, I was scared it was going to bite my face, but it was gone." He wouldn't go back in after that. He left for the day, and the 3 of them had to finish the preparations. It was good and dark by the time they were done, and they were all glad to be gone. None of them had seen any of those inky monsters that he talked about, but They had all seen some weird stuff out of sight. Paul had lost his cell phone, too. He had laid it down on a banister and turned to find it gone. He had given it up as lost, only to find it sitting on the front stoop when they left. Mark swore that he had been pushed, almost tumbling down the stairs, but said it could have just as easily been a loose board as a ghostly hand. Nothing too weird had happened to Shelley, but she made a mental note not to be here by herself. This place just had an aura about it. An aura that was still working on Derek, it seemed. Shelley stepped into the conversation just as Derek was about to storm past Cecily. "What is going on? You two are yelling much too close to the cameras." "I saw it," Derek said, shuddering as Cecily looked blankly at him. Cecily may not have known what he was talking about, but Shelley found herself glancing around. "Where?" "Upper balcony. I saw the lights flashing and looked up to see what the problem was. I saw it up there, staring down at me and smiling. It stared at me for nearly 2 minutes before it just melted away like mist." Shelley shuddered without meaning to. He was describing the balcony that she had been on not 5 minutes ago. "Derek, I need you to go back to your post." Derek bristled. "The hell I will. That thing tried to kill me yesterday, and if tonight goes off without a hitch, none of us will ever need to worry about this kind of crap again. This is a stunt, Derek, a grand gesture to show the network that we mean business. We have an hour left, maybe an hour 30, and we're out the door. I need you to keep it together for that long. Can you do that?" Derek stared at her icily, but finally nodded. "For the show," he breathed. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled over them, Cindy and Lucius providing minor roles when needed. Tobias had always been the show's draw. Tobias had a voice that made people long for the darkest of dark and the worst of the worst. Tobias could tell you how a monster ripped your face off and slaughtered your whole family, and you'd still put it on before bedtime so you could drift off to his sultry voice. Creepshow wanted Tobias. Of that, Shelley had no doubt, and they would get him if she had anything to say about it. When the phantom breeze blew across her ear, she felt herself shudder like a cartoon character. Shelley turned, thinking that Paul or someone was being funny, but there was no one to be seen. That hadn't been an errant breeze, Shelley thought as she put her hand to her ear. As she looked around, Shelley felt she could almost hear a rattling laugh on the breeze, like leaves scuttling across pavement. Someone had blown on her ear, and it had smelled foul, like unbrushed teeth and tobacco. She turned back to the console, a second shudder creeping over the first. This show couldn't be over soon enough. 10 minutes later, the story ended and the audience erupted into applause. I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. It's always good to learn that I'm not the only talking head out there. The audience chuckled politely as they murmured amongst themselves. Our next story is about a phone operator who gets a call from someone a little out of their long-distance plan. Led by Lucius Moore, I give you No Name, No Number. Tobias came off stage, and Shelley went down to talk to him. He was leaning against the wall when she got downstairs, Lucius making his way through the story on stage. Shelley could see Tobias's face lit by the ghostly light of his cell phone and the infernal light of the menthol cigarettes he liked. He was smoking, a habit that Shelley had been trying to break him of. She wrinkled her nose as she directed him outside, reaching out to take the cigarette. "This place is enough of a death trap without you trying to burn it down," she chided quietly. He rolled his eyes, but followed her out. "How's it going out there?" she asked when the stage door was shut behind them. "Amazing. The crowd loves this. This place." He spread his hands out towards the old building. "I can't believe you got a place like this. The ambience and aesthetic are perfect for something like this. I could almost believe it's really haunted." Shelley found herself wishing she believed it a little less, but just nodded along as he continued. "Hey, can I make a change for the next story?" Shelley raised an eyebrow. "We've had the stories listed online for weeks, Tobias. People expect to..." Yeah, I know. I want to read all of them, but this story is trending right now, and I think we should read it. It's seasonal, and I think it'll play well. Maybe we can add 15 minutes to the show for it? Shelley made a noise that he must have found familiar, and Tobias laughed. Don't worry. If it bombs, we can cut it for the Creepshow promo. I think it'll do well, though. Shelley sighed and nodded. Okay, Tobias, but tell it last, okay? Maybe it's a special bonus story or something. He smiled. Thanks, boss. You won't regret it. He turned out to be very wrong on that account. She came back in to find Derek waiting for her near the door. I can't stay. It's stalking me. I gotta... Shelley took a long look at Derek. He was rattled. This bear of a man was rattled by something he had seen here. He was looking around squeamishly, fearfully, and Shelley was surprised when she took him by the shoulder and pulled him down to her eye level. Derek, nothing is out to get you. Now I need you to go back to your station and finish your job. But, she drew his face very close to her. Derek, you're perfectly safe. Now let's go. Shelley walked him back up the stairs, and they found Cecily looking frantically for him. I swear I went to the bathroom for 5 minutes, and when I came back he was gone. Keep an eye on him, Shelley told her, pushing him maybe a little harder than she needed to. Do not let him out of your sight. Cecily nodded, taking Derek by the arm and closing him into the little room he was supposed to be monitoring cameras from. Shelley nodded as she heard the door lock behind them and returned to her duties. She went back downstairs, catching the tail end of the second story and the beginning of the third before stepping outside for a smoke. She may hound Tobias to quit, but her vocal cords weren't the one keeping the channel alive. This whole experience was nerve-wracking as hell. She couldn't imagine having to run another one of these. Luckily, Shelley thought, she wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing after tonight. Someone else would be responsible for these sorts of things, and Shelley could go back to just managing the show. A sound like long nails on slate turned her, and Shelley found herself looking into the eyeless, smiling face of a horror. It stood in the doorway, its body an undulating spot of human-shaped darkness. Shelley felt the cigarette fall from her numb lips as they made eye contact. What eye contact you could make with a creature that lacked eyes. Was this what Derek had seen? Had this thing lunged at her in a dark theater, Shelley would have never set foot on the grounds again. How Derek had talked himself into returning to this place was beyond her. The creature moved ever so subtly, and Shelley watched the door slam shut in her stunned face. She spent the next few minutes yanking on the door, pounding and screaming to be let in. No one answered, though. So she walked around the building, trying doors and yelling at windows. The windows refused to budge, the doors had zero give, and when Shelley tried to call Derek, Cecily, Paul, or anyone else, the calls went straight to voicemail. What the hell was going on in there? Why wouldn't anyone answer her? Surely someone had to hear her with all the noise she was making. When the screaming started, Shelley turned to the building with a cold dread building in her stomach. The screams didn't last long, though. The screams became a kind of laughing as she sat there listening. She called the police. At least she tried to. The police would come. They had to come. They were the people you called for help. They had to come when you called. Shelley didn't know what the police could do against these smiling, shadowy creatures, but she was certain that it would be more than she could. When 911 went straight to voicemail, Shelley knew that this was something different. That's when she remembered the stream. Maybe if she could bring it up, Shelley could find out what was going on inside. If nothing else, maybe she could find some way to fix it. She went to the van and opened her laptop, tapping into the stream easily enough. There was a 10 to 15 minute delay in the video, and perhaps she could use it to see what was happening inside. She saw Lucius finishing his story, and heard the applause as the camera swept to catch Tobias returning to the stage. Thank you, Lucius. What a great story. We've got a special story for you next. One about a perfect audience who seems like just what this comedian's looking for. It's not that hard to imagine such an audience if I try. The audience laughed, but some of it sounded a little strange as it rolled from her speakers. The cameras panned over them, and Shelley could swear she saw some pockets of darkness amongst the crowd. People-shaped things, like the ones that had closed the door, but they were smiling 2 wide smiles and laughing like loons. This next tale is called The Perfect Audience, and it will be read by yours truly, me. He began the story, and Shelley almost imagined she could hear the door slam in the background. He had just gotten started when Shelley heard the strange, canned laughter crackle from the speakers. It was quiet, background noise, the kind of laughter you hear on a sitcom, but she could hear it under the words as Tobias read on. Someone made a shushing sound, but whoever was laughing seemed to ignore them. The camera was on Tobias as he read, the ambient music they always used playing over the speakers. Shelley could still hear that laughter, though, and she wished the camera would pan over again and give her another look at the audience. After a few minutes, Tobias seemed to get distracted. "Okay, guys, let's have some quiet so I can tell the story." He started again, but the laughter had grown. It was odd, hearing it now as it bubbled from the windows, and hearing it there as it barely began. Was this how Cassandra had felt, knowing what horrors were to come, but being helpless to stop them? One of the cameras fell forward then, and Shelley could hear the operator trying to stop himself from snickering. His loud chuckles cut through Tobias's story, and the feed on that camera suddenly went out. The other two cameras were still pointed at Tobias, no one having noticed the operator's laughing fit, and Shelley could still hear the audience chuckling below their sightline. Tobias tried to soldier on, but the laughter became louder, if not lustier. The laughter never rose above that canned alien chuckle, but it seemed to envelop everything it touched. Tobias cleared his throat, Shelley's mind allowing her a vision of his ordinarily placid face glaring over the crowd. Tobias hated to be interrupted, something not many people knew, and she could imagine that he was fuming. "Okay, that's enough. If you're not going to settle down, I'm going to have security removed." But the laughter was getting closer. Shelley could see the crowd swelling with it as it made its way through it like a sickness. Though it stayed at that same monotonous tone, it grew in volume. You could hear Tobias's frustration turning into fear as it rolled on like a wave. The crowd came up just under the sight line, and Shelley could see them beginning to pool at the edges of the stage. The low light hid their faces, but her imagination treated her to a brief glance at the inky black faces and two big teeth of the creatures that she had seen. "Call security. Where's my manager? I need security here right..." But he stopped talking as Lucius began to chuckle. Lucius's mic crackled as he put his hand against it, but Shelley heard Tobias's gasp as the air cut harshly across his own mic. Tobias stood up, turning to Lucius as Cindy screeched in terror. Lucius kept laughing, chuckling as he fell from his chair and his legs bucked against the stage. Cindy was breathing heavily, asking Tobias what was going on, but Tobias wasn't sure. The two of them were moving, trying to get off the stage, but the chuckling audience was all around them now. The monotonous laughter was burrowing into Shelley's skull, and she felt a little like laughing herself. It was infectious. It was terrifying. It was devoid of all mirth or real joy, and was simply the sound of somebody rumbling their laughter for no better reason than to hear it. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in hell. She could hear the broad tide of laughter that surged through the old building and out onto the street. Shelley began to wonder if this was the purpose of the building. Was it to house these things? They had seen them moving just outside their vision, but no one had questioned why the beasts were there. They were ghosts, after all. The spooky ambience was what they were here for. Despite Derek almost getting hurt, and despite all the craziness that had befallen them, Shelley had pushed forward with this. When she heard Tobias start to laugh through his fear, his laughter high and pealing before it became that monotonous canned sound, Shelley realized just how responsible she was. By the time the cameras cut out, the operators falling into fits of laughter, she closed the laptop and sobbed impotently. The police found her at a bar up the street a few hours later. They had been receiving calls after the cast had stopped and gone to investigate. They found everyone inside dead. They had asphyxiated, it appeared, but no sign of foul play could be determined. They had all simply stopped breathing and dropped where they lay. their faces stuck in a rictus of their final laughter. The police were talking about gas leaks, but Shelley knew what she saw. Those people laughed their lives away. They died from something they didn't understand, from something she still didn't quite understand. Shelley decided not to show them the footage. What good would it do anyway? As she sat in her apartment later, Shelley still felt like she could hear that pervasive laughter as it tried to worm its way into her head. She hoped it would pass in time, but she felt like it might be the last thing she ever heard. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, why not go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. If you'd like to get a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. Or if you'd like to support the show more monetarily, you can always come down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you. If you're interested in my books, I always recommend my Ghostly Reader tier. Ghostly Readers get a copy of my book signed on their doorstep anytime I write one, which is at least twice a year. Patrons always get their spooky a little bit early so they can enjoy them before that night's premiere. And speaking of patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet and Winters for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. I'm sure by now you can see some videos appearing at the end here. If you think you might like a little more spooky, why not go ahead and click on another one? I'm sure you can handle a little bit more. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.